Madam Clerk.
Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Honourable Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Finance finally acknowledged that his $5 million stickman campaign was a one-sided partisan affair. He claimed, Honourable Speaker, and I'm quoting, that the government wouldn't offer any arguments in favour of the PST-GST system because, and I quote, and I'm quoting him precisely, there isn't any positives to the PST. Members. There just isn't.
Just wait a second. Continue, ma'am.
Honourable Speaker, will the Premier finally acknowledge what her Minister of Finance acknowledged yesterday, that the BC Liberal Party is using public funds to sell its HST to the public?
The Premier of British Columbia.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the question came very clearly at the end because the Minister of Finance and I were engaged in a little argument about which of us was going to get to answer this HST question today. We have been looking forward to the opposition raising the HST in this legislature for a long time. And why? Why? Because we've been looking forward to the chance to be able to debate whether or not we will have a 12% tax, which of course is what they will support, or whether we will have a 10% tax in British Columbia. Fairer to families, or whether or not we will be unfair to families, which is what they are arguing for. Whether or not we will rebalance the taxation between business and individuals, whether or not we are going to make it easier for families to get ahead, or whether we're going to follow that age-old NDP recipe and keep making it harder and harder for the working people of British Columbia to get ahead. I'm delighted the NDP have finally found the courage to raise this question in the legislature, and I'll look forward to a couple more.
Members, it's going to be one of those days. Leader of the Opposition has a supplemental.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker, because, you know, there are some Liberals who can bring balance to this debate. For example, Honourable Speaker, former Finance Minister Carol Taylor said, and I quote, "This particular tax takes the tax off business. It takes $1.8 billion off of business, and it puts it on to consumers," Honourable Speaker. Then there's the BC Liberal Party itself, Honourable Speaker. Oh, you know, they want to shout that stuff down, Honourable Speaker.
Member, just take your seat for a second. Members. Continue, member.
I think I'll read that again, Honourable Speaker. I think I'll read that again. Former Finance Minister Carol Taylor, Honourable Speaker, BC Liberal Finance Minister, Honourable Speaker, she said when she was describing what the Premier used to describe as the sneaky tactics of all of her colleagues, Honourable Speaker, said this particular tax takes the tax off of business. It takes $1.8 billion off of business, and it puts it on consumers. It did it last year. It's going to do it this year, Honourable Speaker. It's a $3.6 billion tax increase on families because, Honourable Speaker, and that's what the former Minister of Finance says, a $3.6 billion tax increase on families. But what did the BC Liberal Party themselves say, Honourable Speaker? What did they say, Honourable Speaker? They said, quote, The HST would extend the PST tax base to a broader range of goods and services. This is a major concern, Honourable Speaker, a major concern. Major because it means a huge number of items, Honourable Speaker, go from 0%, that's 0%, to 7%, and those are paid by BC families. If the Premier is so confident in her position, why doesn't she stop her political party, the BC Liberal Party, from using public funds to make their case with an ad campaign that's unacceptable to British Columbia?
Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the opposition's coming up with a whole new argument in favor of their 12% tax.
We're working on it.
I'm delighted. I'm delighted to see these arguments finally on the last day of the legislature come to the House. I'm delighted they're finally raising the HST in the legislature. It gives us a chance to talk about whether or not British Columbians.
Continue, Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives us a chance to talk about whether or not who in this House is in favor of a 12% tax or a 2% tax reduction on everything. Who is it in this House that's in favor of a 12% tax? Who is it in this House that doesn't care about fairness for families? Who isn't interested in helping families get a little bit ahead, although we all know that families are increasingly feel like they're struggling? Who is it in this House that doesn't want to address the issues of the independent panel report? Who is it in this House that wants to ignore the views of the 300,000 British Columbians that we talked to in the course of this HST consultation, the largest public consultation in British Columbia's history? Well, of course, it's the New Democrats. It's the New Democrats who have their ears closed. And while they want a 12% tax, the people on this side of the House and British Columbians are saying it's time to shelve the 12.
Members. Leader of the Opposition has a further supplemental.
Well, Honourable Speaker, a $3 billion tax increase on families. Who would believe that's good for families? Perhaps a Premier. Perhaps it's a Premier, Honourable Speaker. Perhaps it's a Premier who complains that we're not debating HST in the House and then brings in closure to stop the debate, Honourable Speaker. I thought, Honourable Speaker, the Premier might have learned in Vancouver Point Grey that it's a good idea to show up for the debate.
Here, here. On time. On time.
I guess, Honourable Speaker, there's no debate when you hire an animated stick man to put forward your position. Will the minister finally cancel that ad campaign? Cancel that ad campaign and ensure that that money goes where it should belong, to BC classrooms, to BC hospitals, to people with developmental disabilities. Will she shelve the campaign now?
Premier.
I don't know why the NDP is so scared of information. They've been complaining there hasn't been enough all these many months, and now all they complain about is that there's too much information getting out there. And I don't say we shelve the campaign, I say we shelve the 12, which I think is what British Columbians will also support. We need to be fair to families, we need to make sure that we're rebalancing the tax burden, and we need to make sure it's a little bit easier for people to try and get ahead in an economy where it's been really tough for a lot of people to get ahead. And I don't think British Columbians are going to buy NDP math. He stands up and he talks about the billions of dollars. Will they believe the math from an opposition leader who produced 8 deficit budgets in a row? Will they believe an opposition leader who was there in the Premier's office when they raised taxes to the highest in Canada? It is no surprise that the NDP want higher taxes. They don't want to have a lower 10% tax. They want to have a higher 12% tax. It's no surprise when it's the same group of people that burden families across British Columbia with the highest income taxes, not just in Canada, but anywhere across this great continent. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is my last chance to answer a question on this topic from the leader. I do hope the next questioner gets up and does the Minister of Finance the courtesy of asking him a question about whether or not, indeed, we should shelve the 12.
Member for Victoria Beacon Hill.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this Premier has proven once again why the public doesn't believe anything the BC Liberals say, especially on the HST. It's now very clear to everyone in the public, Mr. Speaker, that this Premier has spent her time coming up with new slogans instead of standing up for families. Let's take a look at the campaign on the referendum itself, Mr. Speaker. Allowing the pro-HST side to run a campaign with no spending limits, with no disclosure requirements, isn't fair or unbiased. This is the people of British Columbia's referendum, not the BC Liberals' referendum. Shifting the goalposts to give one side the advantage shows complete disrespect for the voters of this province. So my question is to the Premier, why won't you impose spending limits and disclosure requirements right now, today?
This way. Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, one thing you never hear from the NDP opposite is they're not pointing out that there's any errors in those facts and that information campaign, Mr. Speaker. All you hear is they are uncomfortable with those facts, Mr. Speaker, and I can understand why they are uncomfortable with those facts, Mr. Speaker, because the entire time we've been in session, I have been waiting, sitting and waiting, listening to all of their impassioned speeches about why they don't like the HST, but I have yet to hear a single argument about why it makes sense to go back to a 12% PST plus GST, Mr. Speaker. Not a single cogent argument out of that side. But, Mr. Speaker, perhaps it is because 9 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world, including China, India, Taiwan, and Singapore, all have value-added taxes like the HST, Mr. Speaker. But I note with interest that the one country that doesn't, the one country that they're always fond of quoting that still has a retail sales tax today is Cuba. No.
Take your seat. Members. Member has supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's look at the BC Liberals' campaign for this referendum. No spending limits. A referendum ballot in the summer. $5 million of taxpayer money spent on bias advertising. No disclosure. This is unprecedented, Mr. Speaker, so my question again is to the Premier. When will the Premier and the BC Liberals wake up, recognize this is the public's referendum, and stop playing games with the public?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, just for once, could the NDP do their homework and get their story straight? They were just telling us a while back that they wanted to move the referendum forward. The Premier followed through on that commitment and moved the referendum date forward. Mr. Speaker, if they had done their homework, they would have known that moving it forward required moving it over to the Referendum Act to assure that we could actually have an early referendum. And if they read the Referendum Act, they would understand what the rules are around the Referendum Act, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is this Premier has kept her commitment to move the date forward. We have kept our commitment to make sure that the public has information, factual information, to ensure they can make an informed choice. And they are upset because the facts are uncomfortable, and they are trying to argue instead of for a 10% HST with an efficient tax system used by 140 countries around the world, they want to go back to an inefficient dual tax system at 12% with a GST and PST. That makes no sense to anybody, Mr. Speaker.
For Surrey Wally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No surprise that the Finance Minister would choose the example of China. The Minister is on record as being an admirer of Chinese democracy for some time. But the Minister talked about the referendum and the Premier's commitment on the provincial referendum. When she was running for the leadership...
Just take your seat for a second. Continue, member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Premier was running as a leadership candidate for the leadership of her party, she promised in connection with the referendum that it would be conducted in the same manner as a provincial election. When she was in a position to make that decision, she promptly went back on her word. And unlike a provincial election, there are no spending limits for HST proponents, nor are there any disclosure requirements. Perhaps a little bit more of that Chinese example that the Minister of Finance was speaking of. It is the public's referendum. It is the public's referendum, not a BC Liberal donor's referendum, Mr. Speaker. Can the Premier explain why she's adding to the already high level of distrust of the BC Liberal government by conducting the referendum in this way?
Premier of British Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to get up and speak to the opposition again on this issue. As I've said a number of times, we want to make sure that the HST is fair for British Columbians. We want to make sure that we're rebalancing the taxation burden between business and families. The independent panel told us that it wasn't fair the way it was. They told us that families would be on average $350 behind, and so we're fixing that. We're going to a 10% tax, which will mean that every single family will be ahead when it comes to this tax than they would have been under the system that the NDP is advocating. We do need to make sure that taxes are fair for families. I know that isn't an issue you will find at the heart of NDP platform documents. I know that fairness for families isn't part of a record that includes the highest income taxes of anywhere across this continent. I know that fairness for families isn't part of a government that had a record of raising small business taxes by 80%. I know that that's not the kind of fairness for families that they're talking about. But we truly are talking about fairness for families. And it is interesting, as the finance minister pointed out, that every time they do have the temerity to get up and talk about the HST in the legislature, they never talk about the reality of the tax. I hope that the critic will get up and offer us next his defense for why he wants so badly to go back to the PST GST.
Just anything.
Members. The member has supplemental.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I do. The Premier would rather do anything than talk about her broken promise. She promised not to sell BC Rail in the year 2000. She promised a very clear commitment. She promised to conduct this referendum in the same manner as a provincial election. Why doesn't she address the reason why she broke those promises and tell the public why they should trust her ever again?
Premier.
You know, when the critic goes back that far, he is tempting fate. He is tempting fate because, and I think here's the fate. And here's the fate. And here, hold on. Wait for it.
Continue, Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And here is the fate that he is tempting. When he asks a question like that, it's entirely possible that the Minister of Education might not be able to stay in his seat and might have to get up and talk about something like the fast ferries. But we'll stay away from that today. We'll stay away from that today, and I'll do my best to answer the question, Mr. Speaker. We are doing what we can to try and make sure that the HST is fairer for families. That's been my commitment all along. We want to make sure that in this referendum that British Columbians have the information that they need to be able to make a good decision, a well-informed decision. Whatever decision that is, we will accept their verdict. But for my part, and I am unashamed to say this, and I've been saying this for over a year now, I will be voting in favor of the HST, and the new improved HST is going to be much fairer for families. Every family in British Columbia with a 2% tax cut is going to be further ahead than they would be under the tax that the NDP is advocating. A 12% PST GST. I don't think British Columbians want to go back to it, but we'll see what happens as a result of the referendum.
Vancouver Mount Pleasant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In October of last year, the Premier said on the BC Liberal rail corruption scandal, and I quote, "There are outstanding questions the government must answer. For heaven's sakes," she says, "the public has the right to know what those answers are," end quote. But just a few months later, Mr. Speaker, the Premier did another one of her classic flip-flops. The $6 million BC Rail plea bargain is, and I quote, "not something I intend to reconsider." She further says, and I quote, "is a decision that was made and is not something that I'll be revisiting." So funny how that is, Mr. Speaker. Funny how that is, Mr. Speaker. She was curious about the plea bargain when she was a talk show host. But now that she's Premier and has the power to do something about it, poof, that curiosity is gone. So my question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, was her quest for the truth just empty words, just like the promise not to buy votes on the HST?
Attorney General.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. This issue has been canvassed thoroughly, more than 4 hours.
Continue, Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This issue has been canvassed thoroughly for at least 4 hours, maybe more, during the estimates debate in the Ministry of the Attorney General, another hour and a half or so during estimates debate for the Minister of Finance. I understand it's also been canvassed during estimates debate for the Premier. This is how the opposition chooses to spend their time, and that's fine. We have made it clear that we have concerns with what happened. We want to make sure that taxpayers' interests are better protected in the future, and that is why we have retained the services of Mr. Stephen Toop at the University of British Columbia to conduct a review of the indemnity policy to see how it is that it expanded from civil proceedings to criminal matters in the 1990s and beyond. And we want to see what the results of that review are, Mr. Speaker, and we're looking forward to that.
The member has supplemental.
Yes, I do, Mr. Speaker. The current indemnity review does not provide Dr. Toop the mandate to investigate the corruption scandal, and that Dr. Toop has not been directed, Mr. Speaker, to investigate the $6 million payoff, and the Premier knows it. The Premier was in Cabinet when the BC Rail went down. She likes to hear herself talk, Mr. Speaker, so let me just quote her from the year 2000. Let me just quote her.
Members.
She said, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, "We're not going to sell BC Rail," end quote. She was in government when the BC Liberals went back on the election promise to not sell BC Rail, and she was very, very close to the scandal corruption case. Very close, Mr. Speaker. If she expects British Columbians to have faith in her ability to govern and to have a clean record on the BC Rail corruption deal, will she direct Dr. Stephen Toop in writing to investigate the $6 million payout as part of her review? And if not, why not?
Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We can't turn the date back and put a different stamp on the decision that was made. The Leader of the Opposition might choose to do that, but that's not our choice, Mr. Speaker. We do want to find out if there's a way we can better shape the policy for the future. And to quote from the terms of reference, which are publicly available but apparently have not been read by the member asking the question, Mr. Toop is asked to do the following. This review is to consider the rationale for the policy, the history of the development of the policy, how it has been applied in the past, and the need for indemnity arrangements from a public administration perspective. I suggest the member take the time to find the terms of reference, which are available publicly on the Ministry of Attorney General website for all to see.
Members. Members. Member Fraser Nicola.
Thank you. Thank you, Honourable Speaker. 1 minute, two accused Liberal insiders are saying that the BC Liberal corruption scandal goes much higher into the upper echelons of the Liberal government. The next minute,
they plead guilty and take the fall because the Liberals threw $6 million of hush money at them to end the trial just before Gary Collins, a former Liberal minister, was to take the stand. It stinks, Honourable Speaker, and everybody knows it stinks, and the Premier knows it stinks. And even the Premier knows it stinks, and that's why she herself had asked, quote, why did the Crown offer the plea deal in the first place, and why did they feel that they needed to throw in the $6 million indemnity in order to get the accused to sign it? Honourable Speaker, to the Premier, why are you refusing to seek the truth about the BC Liberal corruption scandal and the $6 million payout? Is it because you're afraid that other BC Liberals will be implicated in this Liberal corruption scandal?
Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As has become evident, reading skills are not a strong suit for the opposition. For if they were, they might have read the following article in the Globe and Mail, February 17, 2011, with the headline, Files Exonerate Elected Liberals in BC Rail Scandal. And the first paragraph, Mr. Speaker, an exhaustive police investigation into political corruption surrounding the sale of BC Rail found no evidence of wrongdoing by former BC Liberal Cabinet Minister, now the Premier, or any other elected official, according to documents obtained by the Globe and Mail. Mr. Speaker, perhaps it's time for the opposition to offer an unqualified apology for all the people whose reputations they besmirched within the safety of this legislative chamber. And if they have allegations to make and they're so confident in what they're doing, take it into the hallway and take your chances with the results.
Bell ends question period.